The phone would not stop ringing during my husband's funeral. I remember thinking how strange that was, how rude even, for the world to keep interrupting a moment that felt like it should have been suspended in silence. My name is Margaret Whitmore, and that morning I stood beside a polished oak casket in a small church in Hartford, Connecticut, saying goodbye to the man I had been married to for 43 years. Thomas Whitmore had always been the steady one in our family, the quiet anchor who believed problems should be solved calmly and privately. That was the kind of man he was. The kind who fixed things without announcing it. The kind who noticed when the porch light flickered and replaced it before anyone else even realized it was broken. I had imagined that the day we buried him would feel heavy but peaceful, like the final chapter of a long story told with dignity. Instead, my purse kept vibrating in my hands like a trapped insect, again and again, with the persistence of something that refused to wait for grief to finish its work. The first time it rang, I ignored it. The second time, I turned the phone face down. By the third call, I slipped it deeper into my purse so I wouldn't see the screen light up. I told myself it was probably a wrong number or some telemarketer dialing at the worst possible moment. People from church were lining up to offer condolences, soft voices murmuring the same phrases people always say at funerals. He lived a good life, he was a good man, you're in our prayers. I nodded and thanked them, holding my composure the way Thomas would have expected me to. But the phone kept buzzing. Fourth call. Fifth call. Sixth call. Each time from the same unfamiliar number. The area code wasn't one I recognized. My son Daniel stood a few feet away speaking quietly with a couple of his colleagues, his hand resting on the shoulder of his wife Rachel. They looked composed, almost too composed, like people attending a business meeting rather than their father's funeral. I noticed that detail only briefly at the time, the way you notice a shadow at the edge of a room without thinking much of it. Rachel's voice drifted over to me as she whispered something to Daniel, and both of them glanced toward me quickly before looking away again. Perhaps they were worried about how I was holding up. Perhaps they were simply uncomfortable with grief. Everyone handles these moments differently, I reminded myself. The phone buzzed again. Seventh call. At that point curiosity began to creep in, quietly pushing against my patience. Whoever it was had called 7 times within less than 20 minutes. That kind of persistence doesn't usually come from telemarketers. I stepped away from the cluster of guests and walked down the side aisle of the church, the polished wooden pews gleaming beneath the soft morning light that filtered through the stained glass windows. Outside, the autumn air felt cool and dry, the kind of crisp October morning Thomas used to love. I stood beside a row of maple trees just beyond the church steps and finally pulled the phone from my purse. The number flashed on the screen again before I could even decide what to do. I hesitated for a moment, looking back through the church doors where the quiet hum of voices continued inside. Then I answered. Hello? My voice sounded steadier than I expected. There was a brief pause on the other end, the faint sound of someone exhaling, as if the person had been holding their breath. Then a man spoke. His voice was calm but urgent, the voice of someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. Mrs. Whitmore, he asked. Yes. My name is Ethan Clark. I'm very sorry to call you today of all days. I frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to me. I'm afraid you've reached me during my husband's funeral, I replied. I know, he said quietly. That's exactly why I'm calling. The sentence hung in the air like a weight I couldn't quite understand. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. In the distance I could hear the low rumble of cars passing along the street and the rustling of dry leaves skittering across the pavement. Finally I said, I don't believe we've met, Mr. Clark. No, ma'am, he answered. But your husband knew me. My grip tightened around the phone. Thomas had known many people through the years. Contractors, accountants, business partners, old college friends whose names sometimes surfaced during long dinners when he felt nostalgic. But something about the way this man said the word knew made it sound different, like it carried more weight than a casual acquaintance. What is this about? I asked. Another pause. Then he said something that made the cool October air feel suddenly colder. Your husband asked me to contact you if anything ever happened to him. I blinked slowly, trying to process what I had just heard. Thomas had been many things in his life, but secretive was never one of them. We had shared nearly everything: finances, decisions, worries about our son, plans for retirement. The idea that he had arranged something like this without mentioning it to me felt strange. I'm not sure I understand, I said carefully. I'm afraid you won't yet, Ethan replied. But you will. I glanced back toward the church again. Daniel and Rachel were still standing near the front doors now, speaking with the pastor. Rachel's expression looked tense, though perhaps that was only my imagination. Funerals make everyone uncomfortable. Ethan continued speaking before I could gather my thoughts. Your husband was a very careful man, he said. He believed in preparing for problems before they happened. That at least sounded like Thomas. My husband had always been the kind of person who checked the locks twice before going to bed and kept a flashlight in every drawer just in case the power went out. He also believed in protecting the people he loved, Ethan added. Especially you. I felt my throat tighten slightly. Grief has a strange way of sneaking up on you in the middle of ordinary sentences. What exactly are you trying to tell me? I asked. His answer came quietly, but it landed with a force that made my stomach drop. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, your husband left instructions for me. And after what I've seen happening these past few weeks, I think you need to hear them sooner rather than later. For a moment I simply stood there beneath the maple trees, the phone pressed against my ear while the funeral continued behind me inside the church. The wind stirred the leaves above my head, sending a few of them drifting slowly toward the ground. Somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour. And in that quiet space between one breath and the next, I realized that the day I thought would end with nothing but mourning had just opened the door to something else entirely, something my husband had apparently been preparing for long before I ever suspected there was a reason to. When I returned to the church a few minutes later, the quiet murmur of voices seemed different somehow, as if the room had shifted slightly while I was outside. The same people were there, the same flowers arranged beside the casket, the same soft organ music drifting through the air, but my mind was no longer focused on the grief that had filled it only moments before. Instead I kept hearing the man's voice repeating the same sentence in my head. Your husband asked me to contact you if anything ever happened to him. I slipped my phone back into my purse and walked slowly toward the front of the room where Thomas lay in the polished oak casket we had chosen together 3 days earlier. The funeral director had arranged everything with careful dignity. The deep navy suit Thomas used to wear for formal dinners had been pressed perfectly, his silver hair neatly combed, his hands folded across his chest in the quiet stillness that funerals always seem to hold. I stood there for a moment, studying his face, trying to imagine him organizing secret instructions behind my back. It did not feel like something he would do lightly. Thomas Whitmore believed in planning, yes, but he also believed in partnership. We had spent decades making decisions together, discussing everything from mortgage payments to which brand of coffee tasted best on Sunday mornings. The idea that he had prepared something important without telling me felt less like a betrayal and more like a warning. Perhaps he had wanted to protect me from something I did not yet understand. I felt a hand gently touch my arm. It was the pastor, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Caldwell who had known Thomas for nearly 15 years. He offered me a kind smile and asked if I needed a moment before the final prayer. I thanked him and said I was ready. My voice sounded steady, which surprised me. The ceremony resumed quietly. People bowed their heads as the pastor spoke about Thomas's patience, his generosity, the way he had volunteered every winter helping repair heating systems for elderly neighbors who could not afford repairs. Several people nodded in agreement. Those stories were true. Thomas had always believed that the best kind of help was the kind no one needed to hear about later. As the service continued, I noticed Daniel standing across the aisle with Rachel beside him. My son looked tired but composed, his expression serious in the way people often look when they are trying to appear responsible in difficult situations. Rachel stood close to him, one hand resting lightly on his arm. From a distance they appeared to be the picture of quiet support, the kind of couple people might describe as strong during hardship. Yet something about the way Rachel kept glancing toward me made a small uneasy feeling settle in the back of my mind. It was not a look of sympathy. It was more like the quick calculation someone makes when they are waiting for the next step in a plan. I told myself that grief can make people misinterpret ordinary expressions. It had been a long week for all of us. Still, when the final prayer ended and people began filing slowly out of the church, Daniel approached me almost immediately. He placed a hand gently on my shoulder and asked if I was holding up all right. I told him that I was managing. Rachel stood beside him, offering a polite smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She spoke in a gentle voice and suggested that we should all get some rest later, perhaps talk about practical matters tomorrow. Houses, paperwork, things that always follow funerals like quiet shadows. I nodded again, though the words practical matters lingered in my thoughts longer than I expected. The reception afterward took place in the fellowship hall beside the church. Long tables had been arranged with coffee urns, sandwiches, and small trays of pastries. Friends and neighbors gathered in clusters, sharing memories about Thomas, telling stories about projects he had helped them with over the years. I thanked each person who spoke to me, smiling politely, listening carefully. But every few minutes my attention drifted back to the phone in my purse. Ethan Clark had said very little during our call. Only that Thomas had left instructions and that I needed to hear them soon. He had not explained how he knew my husband or what exactly had made him decide to call during the funeral itself. Yet there had been something in his tone that felt serious, almost cautious, as if he believed the timing mattered. After nearly an hour, the room began to thin out. People offered final condolences and slowly made their way toward the parking lot. Daniel and Rachel moved between guests thanking them for coming, their voices calm and organized, the way people often behave when they believe they are responsible for managing a situation. I noticed Rachel speaking quietly with one of Daniel's colleagues near the back of the room. When she saw me watching, she quickly ended the conversation and turned away. That small detail might have meant nothing. Or it might have meant everything. I could not yet tell which. By the time the last guests had left, the late afternoon sunlight was beginning to fade through the tall windows along the hall. Daniel suggested we head home and rest before dealing with the many arrangements that still needed attention in the coming days. Rachel agreed quickly, mentioning paperwork and insurance forms in the careful tone of someone who had already been thinking several steps ahead. As we stepped outside toward the parking lot, a cool breeze moved through the trees lining the church property. I paused beside my car for a moment, watching the leaves shift gently along the pavement. Daniel walked ahead with Rachel, speaking quietly about meeting again the next morning. I reached into my purse and looked at the phone again. The unfamiliar number remained on the screen from earlier, a silent reminder that the day was not finished revealing its surprises. For a few seconds I considered ignoring it completely, pretending the call had never happened. That would have been the easier choice. Grief already felt heavy enough without adding new mysteries to it. But Thomas had always believed that ignoring warning signs was the fastest way to let small problems grow into large ones. I unlocked the phone and stared at the number again. Then I opened my recent calls and pressed it before I could change my mind. The line rang once. Twice. On the third ring the same calm voice answered. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ethan Clark said quietly, as though he had been expecting the call. "I was wondering when you might reach out again." I took a slow breath and looked across the parking lot where Daniel and Rachel were climbing into their car. "You said my husband left instructions," I told him. "I think it is time you explained what that means." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line before Ethan spoke again, his voice steady but careful. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I believe it is." And in that moment I realized that whatever Thomas had prepared for me was not something meant for comfort. It was something meant for protection. I sat in my car for a few seconds after Ethan Clark answered the phone, watching Daniel's sedan slowly pull out of the church parking lot with Rachel in the passenger seat. The taillights disappeared down Maple Street, leaving the lot almost empty except for a few scattered vehicles and the quiet stone building behind me where my husband's funeral had just taken place. For 43 years Thomas Whitmore had been the person I spoke to at the end of every difficult day. Now I was sitting alone with a stranger on the phone telling me that my husband had left instructions I had never heard about. I took a slow breath before speaking again. You said my husband asked you to contact me if anything happened to him, I said carefully. I need to understand why. Ethan Clark did not answer immediately. I could hear the faint hum of what sounded like an office environment on his side of the line, perhaps the distant echo of air conditioning or traffic through a window. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but measured, the way people sound when they are choosing each word carefully. Your husband came to see me about 6 months ago, he said. He wanted a second set of eyes on some financial matters connected to his company. I frowned slightly. Thomas had owned a small construction supply business for nearly 25 years. It was successful but not the sort of operation that usually required secret consultations. Thomas had an accountant, I said. We have worked with the same firm for years. Yes, Ethan replied. And that is exactly why he came to me. His words hung in the quiet air of the car. I turned slightly in my seat, looking again at the empty parking lot where the last guests from the funeral had already driven away. What do you mean by that? I asked. Ethan paused again before answering. Your husband believed something was wrong, he said. He believed someone inside the company was moving money in ways that did not make sense. My fingers tightened slightly around the phone. Thomas had always been attentive to numbers. He kept neat folders of receipts in the home office and balanced the company accounts every Sunday evening with a calculator and a yellow legal pad. Did he tell you who he suspected? I asked. At first he did not want to jump to conclusions, Ethan said. But over time the pattern became difficult to ignore. A breeze moved across the parking lot, pushing a swirl of dry leaves against the curb near my car. I felt an uneasy weight settle in my chest. What pattern? I asked quietly. Ethan's answer came slowly. Withdrawals from company accounts that were authorized but poorly documented. Transfers between internal accounts that happened late in the evening. Changes to financial access permissions. I listened carefully, trying to imagine Thomas discovering something like that. He would not have panicked. He would have studied it quietly, the way he studied everything else in life. Did he figure out who was responsible? I asked. Ethan hesitated for a moment longer this time. Yes, he said. He believed he had. I waited, my heart beating a little faster than before. Finally I said the question that had already begun forming in my mind. Who? The silence that followed lasted several seconds. Then Ethan answered in a steady voice. Your son, Daniel. For a moment I did not react at all. The name simply hung in the air between us as if my mind refused to accept it. Daniel Whitmore had worked at his father's company for more than a decade. Thomas had brought him in after college, teaching him every aspect of the business from supplier contracts to delivery logistics. It had been something Thomas was proud of, building a company that could eventually become part of our son's future. That cannot be right, I said slowly. Daniel would never take advantage of his own father. Ethan's voice remained calm. Your husband struggled with that possibility as well, he said. For months he looked for other explanations. Clerical errors. Software glitches. Even mistakes made by the bank. But every time he reviewed the numbers the trail led back to the same account permissions. I leaned back against the seat, staring through the windshield at the empty road ahead of me. What kind of money are we talking about? I asked quietly. Over the past 2 years the total exceeded $2 million, Ethan replied. The number landed with a strange dull weight in my chest. $2 million was not the sort of figure that could disappear quietly from a business without consequences. Yet Thomas had never mentioned anything like that to me. Not once. Why would Daniel do something like that? I whispered, more to myself than to Ethan. Your husband believed someone might be influencing him, Ethan said. Someone who encouraged him to take shortcuts. My mind immediately pictured Rachel standing beside Daniel in the fellowship hall earlier that afternoon, her polite smile and calculating eyes scanning the room. I pushed the thought away quickly. It felt unfair to jump to conclusions. If Thomas suspected something like this, I said carefully, why did he not confront Daniel directly? Ethan answered with a quiet certainty that made my stomach tighten again. Because he wanted to be absolutely sure first, he said. And because he wanted to protect you. I closed my eyes briefly. That was exactly the kind of reasoning Thomas would use. Calm. Methodical. Patient. So what did he do? I asked. Ethan's response came with a note of seriousness that had not been there before. He began preparing a set of safeguards, he said. Legal and financial ones. I felt my pulse quicken slightly. Safeguards for what? I asked. For the moment when everything might come to light, Ethan replied. I sat silently for several seconds after that, absorbing the meaning behind his words. My husband had not simply suspected something was wrong. He had been preparing for it. Mrs. Whitmore, Ethan continued gently, there is a reason he asked me to contact you if anything happened to him. I opened my eyes again and looked at the quiet road stretching away from the church parking lot. And what is that reason? I asked. Ethan Clark answered in a voice that sounded both cautious and determined. Because now that your husband is gone, he said, you are the only person who can activate the protection he put in place. I did not start the engine right away. Instead I sat there in the quiet parking lot outside the church, my phone still pressed to my ear while Ethan Clark's last sentence echoed slowly through my mind. You are the only person who can activate the protection he put in place. For a moment I simply stared at the empty road ahead of me, trying to reconcile the image of my husband that I had carried for more than 4 decades with the man Ethan was describing. Thomas Whitmore had always been careful, yes. Organized. Thoughtful. But secretive? Strategic in this way? That part of him had never been visible to me before. What exactly did he put in place? I finally asked. Ethan exhaled softly on the other end of the line, as though he had expected that question from the beginning. Several things, he said. But the most important one is something called a protective trust. The word trust sounded familiar, though I had never dealt with one personally. I had heard friends mention them when discussing estate planning, usually in connection with wealthy families who wanted to control how money was distributed. But Thomas had never once brought up the idea with me. I thought everything was already arranged in the will, I said slowly. Your husband did have a will, Ethan replied. However, a will only takes effect after it is read and processed through probate. That process can take months. Sometimes longer. I listened carefully as he continued. Your husband realized that if the financial activity he suspected was real, then waiting for the will might give the wrong people time to move more assets or alter company decisions. A quiet chill moved through me as I began to understand the logic behind Thomas's thinking. So the trust was created to prevent that? I asked. Exactly, Ethan said. The trust holds controlling authority over several of the company accounts and properties. But it only becomes active when a specific condition occurs. I already knew what he was going to say before he finished the sentence. When Thomas passed away, I said quietly. Yes, Ethan replied. I rested my head lightly against the seat behind me. The late afternoon sun had begun to sink lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the church parking lot. For a few seconds I watched those shadows stretch slowly across the pavement while my mind tried to catch up with the new reality forming around me. My husband had suspected something serious enough to build a legal safeguard around our entire financial life. And he had done it quietly, without telling me, because he believed the danger might come from someone inside our own family. If this trust exists, I said carefully, why has no one mentioned it before? Ethan answered in a tone that sounded almost respectful. Because your husband designed it that way, he said. The trust documents were sealed with instructions that they would only be revealed to you, and only after his death. My fingers tightened around the phone again. Only to me? Yes, ma'am, Ethan said. You are the sole activation authority. The phrase sounded formal and strangely powerful at the same time. For decades I had been the quiet partner behind Thomas's business life, managing our home, attending company dinners, greeting employees during holiday gatherings. I had never considered myself the person who would suddenly hold control over anything significant. What happens if I activate it? I asked. Ethan paused briefly before answering. If you choose to activate the trust, it immediately transfers decision-making authority for the company and several related assets to you as trustee. The word trustee felt unfamiliar on my tongue even as I repeated it silently in my mind. Meaning I would control the company? I asked. Yes, Ethan said. Including access to financial records and the authority to review any transactions made during the past several years. I looked again at the quiet street beyond the parking lot. Daniel had been preparing to take over more responsibilities at the company for a long time. Thomas had talked about easing into retirement within the next few years, letting our son gradually step into the leadership role. If what Ethan was saying was true, that entire plan had already changed without Daniel knowing it. Does Daniel know about this trust? I asked. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. No, he said. Your husband was very clear about that. I felt a slow wave of sadness move through me then, deeper than the shock of anything Ethan had said so far. Thomas had not only suspected his own son. He had prepared a system that would quietly take power away from him. That was not something a father would do lightly. When did he create it? I asked. Approximately 4 months ago, Ethan replied. After he confirmed several financial irregularities that concerned him. I closed my eyes briefly again. 4 months ago Thomas had still been sitting at the kitchen table every morning drinking coffee with me while reading the newspaper. He had still been asking about the neighbor's new garden fence and reminding me to water the rose bushes before the first frost. Through all of that normal conversation he had apparently been carrying a secret plan designed to protect everything we had built together. Mrs. Whitmore, Ethan said gently after a moment of silence, your husband believed you deserved the truth and the authority to respond to it. I opened my eyes again and watched a single brown leaf tumble slowly across the hood of my car. What do I need to do? I asked. Ethan's reply came quietly but firmly. The first step is very simple, he said. Tomorrow morning I would like you to meet me at my office. There are documents your husband left that you need to see with your own eyes. I considered that for a moment. The idea of stepping into a lawyer's office less than 24 hours after burying my husband felt almost unreal. But the alternative was pretending that the conversation we had just had never happened. And something deep inside me told me that Thomas Whitmore had not spent months building legal protections simply to have them ignored. All right, I said finally. Tell me where. Ethan gave me the address slowly, a quiet office building in downtown Hartford only 15 minutes from the home Thomas and I had shared for more than 20 years. After I repeated the address back to him, he spoke one last sentence before ending the call. Mrs. Whitmore, he said carefully, once you see what your husband discovered, things may begin to make a lot more sense. I lowered the phone slowly after the call ended and sat in silence for several seconds. The parking lot remained empty around me. The church doors were closed now, the day's ceremony finished. But as I started the car and pulled slowly toward the road, I had the strange feeling that my husband's final plans were only just beginning to unfold. I arrived home just before sunset that evening, and for the first time in more than 4 decades the house felt unfamiliar to me. It was the same white colonial home Thomas and I had moved into 22 years earlier, the same front porch with the wooden swing he had installed himself, the same flower beds that lined the walkway. Yet the silence inside the house felt heavier than it ever had before. When I stepped through the front door the faint scent of Thomas's aftershave still lingered in the hallway, a quiet reminder that only 3 days earlier he had been walking through these same rooms as if nothing in the world could suddenly change. I set my purse on the small table near the door and stood there for a moment listening to the stillness. Normally at that hour Thomas would have been sitting in the living room reading the evening news on his tablet or flipping through one of the construction trade magazines he kept stacked beside the armchair. Instead the room was empty. The armchair remained exactly where he had left it, the reading glasses resting neatly on the side table beside it. For a moment I simply stared at them, remembering the hundreds of quiet evenings we had spent together in that room, speaking about small ordinary things like weekend plans or the neighbors down the street. Eventually I walked slowly toward the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. My mind kept returning to the conversation with Ethan Clark in the parking lot. Everything he had told me sounded calm and factual, but the implications behind those facts were enormous. Thomas had suspected that someone inside his own company had been quietly taking money for years. According to Ethan, that person was our son Daniel. I leaned lightly against the kitchen counter and tried to imagine that possibility without immediately rejecting it. Daniel had grown up in this house. I could still picture him running through the backyard with a baseball glove that looked far too large for his 10-year-old hands. Thomas had taught him how to ride a bicycle on the sidewalk out front, jogging beside him until Daniel finally balanced on his own. For most of Daniel's childhood, Thomas had talked proudly about one day building the company into something his son could inherit. The idea that Daniel might have betrayed that trust felt almost impossible to accept. Yet the more I thought about the past 2 years, the more certain memories began to surface that I had ignored at the time. Daniel had started spending more time at the office, often staying late well after Thomas had come home. Rachel had occasionally made small remarks during family dinners about how difficult it was to manage money while waiting for a business to grow. At the time, those comments had sounded like ordinary complaints about financial pressure. Now they felt slightly different, as though they might have been hints of something deeper. I carried my glass of water into the living room and sat down in Thomas's armchair. The cushions still held the faint impression of the way he used to sit there every evening. Without thinking, I reached for the small stack of papers on the side table, expecting to see his usual reading material. Instead, I noticed something unusual. Beneath the magazines lay a thin manila envelope I had never seen before. My name was written across the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting. Margaret. Just that single word. For several seconds I stared at the envelope without touching it. Thomas had never been the sort of man who left mysterious notes around the house. Everything he did had a practical purpose. Slowly I set the glass of water down and picked up the envelope. It felt light in my hands, containing only a few sheets of paper. The flap was not sealed. I opened it carefully and slid the contents onto my lap. Inside were 2 documents and a short handwritten note. The note was written in Thomas's steady block lettering, the same handwriting he had used for grocery lists and birthday cards for decades. I began reading it slowly. Margaret, if you are reading this, then it means Ethan has already contacted you. I know this may feel confusing at first, but please trust that everything I have done was meant to protect you. Over the past 2 years I have discovered several financial actions within the company that I cannot explain honestly. I wanted to believe they were mistakes. Unfortunately, the evidence suggests otherwise. If I am correct, the situation may become complicated after I am gone. That is why I asked Ethan Clark to help establish the trust he will explain to you. I did not tell you about it earlier because I needed to confirm the facts first, and because I never wanted to worry you unnecessarily. You have always been the strongest and most thoughtful person I know. I trust your judgment completely. When the time comes, you will know what to do. Thomas. I lowered the note slowly after finishing it. My husband's words carried the same calm tone he had used throughout our entire marriage. There was no anger in the message, no accusation, only quiet certainty and trust in my ability to handle whatever came next. Beneath the note were the 2 documents. The first appeared to be a printed confirmation letter from a legal office. At the top of the page I recognized Ethan Clark's name. The letter confirmed the creation of something called the Whitmore Protective Trust. My eyes moved slowly across the page as I read the formal language describing its purpose. The trust granted controlling authority over several of Thomas's business accounts and properties to a designated trustee upon activation. The name of that trustee appeared clearly in the final paragraph. Margaret Whitmore. I sat motionless in the armchair for several seconds after reading those words. For most of my life I had watched Thomas manage the complicated world of contracts, accounts, and supplier agreements while I handled the quieter details of family life. Yet sometime during the past few months he had quietly arranged for the entire structure of his business to pass into my hands if something went wrong. I picked up the second document and read the heading at the top. It was a list of financial account numbers connected to the company along with a short note beside several entries. Access suspended upon trust activation. As the meaning of that sentence settled in my mind, I felt a slow wave of understanding begin to form. If Ethan Clark was right, and if Thomas had truly uncovered evidence of financial misconduct inside his own company, then activating this trust would immediately freeze certain accounts and reveal every transaction connected to them. And if Daniel had been responsible for those transactions, the truth would appear in plain numbers for everyone to see. I looked again at Thomas's handwritten note resting on my lap. You will know what to do. For the first time since leaving the church parking lot earlier that afternoon, I began to understand what my husband had been preparing me for. I did not sleep very much that night. The house was quiet in a way that felt almost unfamiliar, as though the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence of the man who had lived inside them for more than 2 decades. I remained in the living room long after the sun had set, Thomas's note resting on the coffee table in front of me while the envelope and trust documents lay beside it. Several times I read the note again, tracing each word slowly as if the shape of his handwriting might reveal something more than the meaning alone. Thomas had always believed in careful preparation. But this was something beyond ordinary planning. This was a safeguard built quietly behind the scenes, waiting for the moment when it might be needed. Sometime after midnight I finally turned off the living room lights and walked down the hallway toward the bedroom. The bed looked far too large, with only one pillow slightly indented from the nights I had slept there alone since Thomas passed away 3 days earlier. I lay awake for a long time staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the distant sound of a car passing down the street. Eventually sleep came in brief fragments rather than rest. By morning the sunlight was already pushing through the bedroom curtains when I opened my eyes again. For a moment I forgot about everything that had happened the day before. The funeral. The phone calls. Ethan Clark. Then my gaze moved to the empty side of the bed and the memory returned all at once. I dressed slowly that morning, choosing a simple navy sweater and gray slacks. Thomas had always told me that calm thinking required a calm mind, and a calm mind required small routines. So I followed the same routine I had followed for years. I brewed coffee. I watered the rose bushes outside the kitchen window. I read the morning headlines on my tablet even though I barely absorbed a single word. By 9:30 I picked up the envelope and placed it carefully into my purse. Ethan Clark had asked me to meet him at his office that morning. If Thomas had trusted this man enough to build an entire legal structure around his advice, then I needed to hear what he had to say in person. The drive into Hartford took about 15 minutes, just as Ethan had predicted. The office building he had mentioned stood on a quiet street a few blocks from the old courthouse, a modern glass structure surrounded by neatly trimmed landscaping. I parked in the visitor lot and sat in the car for a moment before stepping out. The air was cool and clear, the kind of crisp morning that usually made Thomas comment about how good the weather was for starting new projects. I walked inside the building and took the elevator to the 4th floor. Ethan's office door displayed a simple brass plaque that read Clark Financial Consulting. When I knocked, the door opened almost immediately. The man who greeted me appeared to be in his early 50s, tall with graying hair and a composed expression that suggested he was accustomed to serious conversations. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said with a respectful nod. "Thank you for coming." His office was quiet and orderly, filled with shelves of neatly arranged files and a large desk positioned near the windows overlooking the street below. He offered me a chair across from his desk and poured 2 glasses of water before sitting down. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Ethan folded his hands calmly on the desk. "Before we discuss the documents your husband left," he said, "I want to begin by saying that Thomas Whitmore was a very careful and honorable man. Everything he did during the past several months was guided by one goal: protecting you." I nodded slowly. "I believe that," I said. "I found a note from him last night." I removed the envelope from my purse and placed the handwritten message on the desk. Ethan glanced at it briefly and nodded again. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly the kind of message he told me he planned to leave." He then opened a drawer and removed a thick folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. "Inside this folder," he explained, are the documents connected to the Whitmore Protective Trust. I opened the folder carefully. The first page displayed the same name I had seen the night before. Whitmore Protective Trust. Below it were several pages of legal language describing the structure Thomas had created. Ethan waited patiently while I read through the opening paragraphs. Eventually I looked up at him. "If I understand this correctly," I said slowly, "activating this trust would give me full authority over the company accounts." "That is correct," Ethan replied. "Your husband wanted to ensure that the person he trusted most would have immediate control if his concerns proved accurate." I turned another page. The documents outlined a process for freezing several business accounts until a full financial review could be completed. My eyes stopped on a list of account activity summaries attached near the back of the folder. The numbers on that page were larger than I had expected. Transfers, withdrawals, account adjustments. All of them documented in careful detail. "These are the transactions Thomas discovered," Ethan said quietly as he saw where I was looking. "Most of them were authorized using credentials connected to your son's management profile." I stared at the page for a long moment without speaking. The numbers did not look like mistakes. They looked deliberate, carefully spaced across months and years. I closed the folder slowly. "What happens if I activate the trust today?" I asked. Ethan answered without hesitation. "If you sign the activation document, the trust becomes effective immediately. The accounts listed here will be frozen for review, and the company's financial oversight will transfer to you as trustee." I considered that for several seconds. My husband had prepared everything carefully. The documents, the safeguards. Even the man sitting across from me who had quietly called during the funeral to make sure I would not miss what Thomas had left behind. I placed my hands calmly on the desk and looked directly at Ethan Clark. "My husband believed something was wrong," I said. "I think it is time to find out if he was right." I signed the document slowly, taking a moment to steady my hand before placing the pen on the paper. My signature, Margaret Whitmore, appeared beneath the formal line labeled Trust Activation Authorization. The moment the ink touched the page, something inside me shifted. For decades I had been the quiet partner behind Thomas's decisions. Now, without ceremony or announcement, the responsibility he had prepared was moving directly into my hands. Ethan Clark watched quietly as I finished writing my name. When I slid the paper back across the desk, he nodded once and placed it carefully into the folder. "It is done," he said calmly. "The trust is now active." I did not feel powerful or dramatic in that moment. I felt focused. Focused in the way Thomas used to look when he was studying blueprints at the dining table late at night, tracing lines carefully before making a final decision. Ethan opened another section of the folder and removed several additional pages. "Now that the trust has been activated," he explained, "the system will begin applying the restrictions your husband established." He turned the papers toward me. The documents outlined a series of financial institutions connected to the company accounts. Each entry listed the same phrase beside it. "Access temporarily suspended pending trustee review." I read the lines slowly. "How long before this takes effect?" I asked. "In most cases the notifications are immediate," Ethan replied. "Within the next hour several account permissions connected to the company will automatically be paused until you authorize further activity." I understood exactly what that meant. If Daniel had been using those accounts to move money, the system would suddenly block him. Not quietly. Not gradually. Immediately. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "Your husband believed that if anything improper was happening, the first sign would be confusion from the person responsible." I looked down again at the printed transaction summaries inside the folder. The numbers were precise and methodical, stretching back over 2 full years. Thomas had not rushed into this decision. He had watched, verified, confirmed. And then he had quietly built a structure designed to reveal the truth when the time came. "What happens next?" I asked. Ethan folded his hands again. "Now we observe," he said simply. I left his office shortly after that conversation ended. The elevator ride down to the lobby felt strangely quiet, as though the world outside the building had no idea how much had just changed inside one small office on the 4th floor. When I stepped outside, the morning sun had climbed higher above the city streets, reflecting brightly against the glass windows of nearby buildings. Traffic moved normally along the road. People walked past carrying coffee cups and briefcases, completely unaware that my life had shifted into an entirely new direction less than 30 minutes earlier. I drove home slowly, following the familiar streets that Thomas and I had traveled together thousands of times over the years. When I reached the house, I placed the folder on the kitchen table and made another cup of coffee. Then I waited. It did not take very long. At exactly 11:17 in the morning, my phone began to ring. The name on the screen read Daniel Whitmore. I stared at the phone for 2 seconds before answering. "Good morning, Daniel," I said calmly. My son's voice sounded slightly strained. On the other end of the line. "Mom," he said quickly. "Are you at home?" "Yes," I replied. "Why?" There was a brief pause before he spoke again. "Something strange just happened at the office," he said. "I tried to log into one of the company accounts and it says access has been restricted." I lifted my coffee cup slowly and took a sip before responding. "That does sound unusual," I said. Daniel continued speaking, his tone shifting between confusion and frustration. "It is not just one account either," he said. "Several of them are suddenly locked. I called the bank and they told me there was a trustee review placed on the accounts this morning." He paused. "Do you know anything about that?" I looked through the kitchen window toward the rose bushes Thomas had planted years earlier. The petals were beginning to fade as autumn approached, but the plants were still standing tall against the cool breeze. "Yes," I said quietly. There was another pause on the line. "You do?" Daniel asked. "How?" I set the coffee cup down carefully on the table. "Your father made some arrangements before he passed away," I explained. The silence that followed lasted longer this time. Finally Daniel spoke again. "What kind of arrangements?" I chose my words carefully, the same way Thomas had always done during difficult conversations. "He created something called the Whitmore Protective Trust," I said. "And yesterday I activated it." Daniel did not respond immediately. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded tighter than before. "Why would Dad do something like that?" he asked. I glanced at the folder resting on the kitchen table beside me. Inside it were the documents Thomas had prepared, the transaction records Ethan had shown me, and the evidence my husband had quietly gathered over 2 long years. "Because he wanted to make sure everything was exactly the way it should be," I answered calmly. Daniel let out a slow breath on the other end of the line. "Well," he said carefully, "I think we should talk about this in person." I expected that suggestion. "I agree," I replied. "Come by the house this afternoon." When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the table and looked once more at the folder Thomas had left behind. The plan he had prepared was working exactly as he intended. The accounts had been frozen. The questions had begun. And somewhere inside the company my husband had built from the ground up, the truth was beginning to surface. I spent the next 2 hours moving quietly through the house, doing small ordinary things while waiting for Daniel to arrive. I washed the coffee cup and placed it carefully in the rack beside the sink. I folded the blanket on the living room sofa that I had used the night before. I watered the rose bushes again, even though they had already been watered that morning. The routine was not really about chores. It was about keeping my mind steady while the situation continued unfolding exactly the way Thomas had predicted. By early afternoon the sky outside had turned pale blue, and a soft autumn breeze moved gently through the branches of the maple tree in the front yard. Around 3:15 I saw Daniel's car pull into the driveway. Rachel stepped out of the passenger side before the engine had even fully stopped. The two of them walked toward the front door with quick, determined steps. When I opened the door, Rachel spoke first. "Margaret, we came as soon as Daniel called," she said, her voice polite but tight. I stepped aside to let them enter. Of course, I replied calmly. I expected you would. Daniel walked into the living room and glanced around briefly before turning toward me. He looked tired, though there was something else in his expression as well. Concern perhaps, or maybe calculation. Mom, he said, I just got off the phone with the bank again. They confirmed the accounts are frozen under something called the Whitmore Protective Trust. He paused and studied my face. You activated it. I nodded once. Yes. Rachel folded her arms lightly. We did not even know that trust existed, she said. Why would Thomas set something like that up without telling anyone? I walked toward the kitchen table where the folder still rested exactly where I had left it earlier. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the table's surface, illuminating the thick stack of documents inside the folder. Your father believed certain things needed to be verified, I said calmly as I opened it. Daniel stepped closer, his eyes immediately scanning the pages. Verified, he repeated. Verified what? I lifted one of the printed transaction summaries and placed it in front of him. The page displayed a long list of account movements, each one marked with a date, time, and authorization code. Daniel's eyes moved quickly across the numbers. Rachel leaned slightly forward beside him to read the same lines. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally Daniel straightened slightly. These are company transfers, he said. Normal ones. I did not raise my voice. I simply pointed to a column near the center of the page. Your father noticed that these transfers often occurred late at night, I said. After normal business hours. Daniel frowned slightly. Sometimes work continues after hours, he replied. Rachel nodded beside him. That is common in growing companies, she added. I slid another page across the table. This one contained a longer summary covering nearly 2 full years. The numbers were larger. Much larger. Thomas reviewed these records several times, I said quietly. He also had an independent consultant review them. Daniel's eyes moved down the page again. Mom, these numbers do not prove anything, he said. They are internal movements between company accounts. I watched him carefully while he spoke. His tone remained controlled, but the speed of his explanations had increased. Rachel crossed her arms again. And even if they were unusual, she said, freezing the company accounts without warning could damage the business. I closed the folder gently and rested my hands on top of it. Your father considered that possibility, I said. That is why he created the trust carefully. Daniel shook his head slightly. I still do not understand why he would not just talk to me if he had concerns, he said. The room fell quiet for a moment after that sentence. I looked at my son and remembered the boy who used to build small wooden birdhouses with Thomas in the garage on summer afternoons. Back then Thomas had spoken about Daniel with a mixture of pride and hope. He had believed the company would one day belong to his son. He wanted to be absolutely certain before asking difficult questions, I said finally. Rachel stepped closer to the table, her eyes narrowing slightly. And you are certain now? She asked. I met her gaze calmly. I am certain that your father believed something was wrong, I replied. Daniel ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly. So what happens now? He asked. I opened the folder again and removed a single sheet from the back. It was the trust activation confirmation that Ethan had printed earlier that morning. I placed it in front of them both. Now we review everything, I said. Every account. Every transfer. Every authorization. Rachel looked down at the document and then back at me. And how long will that take? She asked. I leaned back slightly in the chair, remembering the final line Thomas had written in his note the night before. You will know what to do. As long as it takes to understand the truth, I said calmly. The room grew quiet again after that. Outside the window the wind moved gently through the fading rose bushes Thomas had planted years earlier. For a long moment none of us spoke. But the tension in the room had already begun to reveal something far more powerful than any argument could have. Thomas Whitmore had spent months preparing for this moment. And now that the accounts were frozen and the records were open, the truth he had suspected was slowly beginning to step into the light. I remained seated at the kitchen table while Daniel and Rachel stood across from me, the open folder resting between us like a quiet witness to everything my husband had spent months preparing. The late afternoon light continued drifting slowly across the floor, and for a moment the room felt strangely calm despite the tension that now filled the air. Daniel was the first to break the silence. He pulled out one of the chairs and sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together as if trying to collect his thoughts. Rachel remained standing beside him, her posture straight, her expression composed in the careful way someone maintains when they believe they are being watched closely. "Mom," Daniel said finally, "freezing the accounts like this is going to create serious problems for the company. Payroll goes through those systems. Vendor payments too." I listened without interrupting. His voice carried the same persuasive tone he had used as a teenager whenever he tried to explain why a broken window or a late-night curfew violation was somehow not entirely his fault. "Your father understood how the company operates," I replied calmly. "He built those systems himself." Daniel leaned forward slightly. "Exactly," he said. "Which is why it does not make sense that he would suddenly lock everything down without talking to me first." Rachel nodded beside him. "Thomas trusted Daniel with the business for years," she added. "He would not have created something this extreme without explaining it." I rested my hands on the folder and looked at both of them carefully. "Your father did explain it," I said quietly. "He explained it in the documents he prepared." Daniel's eyes moved again toward the transaction summaries scattered across the table. "Those numbers still do not prove anything," he said. "They are internal transfers. Sometimes accounts have to be adjusted." I slid one of the pages closer to him. "Then perhaps you can help me understand something," I said. Daniel glanced down at the sheet again. "What?" he asked. I pointed to a sequence of transfers listed across several weeks during the previous winter. "These funds moved from the equipment reserve account into a temporary operating account," I said. "Then they were transferred again 2 days later into a private holding account under your authorization credentials." Daniel's expression shifted slightly as he studied the lines more carefully. Rachel leaned over his shoulder to read the same entries. "That is a normal liquidity adjustment," Daniel replied quickly. "Sometimes money needs to be repositioned to cover expenses." I nodded once. "Your father asked the same question," I said. "Which is why he tracked where the funds moved next." I reached into the folder and removed another page, placing it gently on the table. This document contained a detailed chart of follow-up transactions connected to the same funds. The numbers showed a pattern of transfers that ended not in another company account, but in a separate investment account opened less than 18 months earlier. Daniel stared at the page for several seconds. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly as she read the same line. "That account was created to diversify assets," Rachel said quickly. "Many companies do that." I did not raise my voice. "That account is registered under your name," I said quietly. Rachel's expression tightened almost immediately. Daniel looked from the document to Rachel and then back to me. "Mom," he said carefully, "Rachel manages several financial projects for the company." I leaned back slightly in my chair. "The account contains $875,000 from the company reserves," I said. The room became very still after that. Outside the window a car passed slowly along the street, the faint sound of its tires moving across the pavement drifting through the quiet house. Daniel exhaled slowly. "That money was being repositioned," he said again, though his voice no longer sounded as confident as before. Rachel crossed her arms once more. "It was temporary," she added. "The funds were going to be reinvested into expansion projects." I looked at them both for a long moment before speaking again. "Your father spent 6 months verifying these records," I said. "He also hired an independent consultant to review them." Daniel's gaze returned to the documents again. "Ethan Clark," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. Rachel's posture shifted slightly as if she were recalculating something in her mind. "Even if Thomas suspected something," she said carefully, "freezing the accounts without warning could cause panic among employees. I nodded slowly. That is why the trust only freezes accounts connected to the transfers under review, I said. Daniel looked up quickly. What does that mean? I closed the folder gently and folded my hands together on the table. Payroll and supplier accounts remain active, I explained. Your father wanted to protect the company, not harm it. Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at the table in silence. Rachel remained still beside him, her eyes moving once more across the documents that Thomas had carefully prepared months earlier. Finally Daniel spoke again, though his voice sounded quieter now. What are you planning to do next? He asked. I glanced toward the hallway where Thomas's armchair sat in the living room exactly as he had left it. For decades he had guided this family and the company he built with patience and careful thought. Even now, after his passing, the structure he created was continuing to do exactly what he intended. I turned back toward Daniel and Rachel. Tomorrow morning I will meet with Ethan Clark again, I said. We will begin a full financial review of the company records. Rachel's expression tightened slightly. And if the review finds something? She asked. I held her gaze calmly. Then we will deal with the truth, I said. No one spoke after that. The documents remained spread across the kitchen table, the quiet evidence of a plan my husband had set in motion long before the funeral that began this story. Thomas Whitmore had trusted that when the time came, I would know what to do. And now that the moment had arrived, I intended to finish what he started.